The Mastercase H500M by Cooler Master sports dual 200mm addressable RGB fans, a USB 3.1 Gen 2 Type-C port, and 4 tempered glass side panels, both sides, top, and front, and the front can swap out for a mesh panel if you want maximum airflow. It has a plethora of cable routing covers to keep things tidy too, so click the sponsor link in the description to learn more.
Excellent!
Hello everyone and welcome at last to my GeForce RTX series review video where I can finally share benchmarks and testing results for the RTX 2080 and 2080 Ti. My focus today is going to be on the Founders Edition's versions of both GPUs with comparisons to the GTX 1080 Ti, the GTX 1080, and the AMD Radeon Vega 64. I tested in 4K, 1440, and 1080, so if you're impatient, you can jump to the benchmarks at that time code in this video. For now though, let's briefly talk about the new technology in these Turing-based GPUs and why I'm mostly ignoring it in this review. So the GTX 10 series was based on the Pascal architecture, and this launched in 2016. But then in 2017, NVIDIA developed new GPUs that was based on the follow-up Volta architecture, but they didn't actually launch any consumer-focused Volta products like GPUs because there was nothing from Radeon to compete with after Vega's lackluster launch in 2017. So now in 2018, we have the Turing architecture, which, like Volta, features tensor cores for hardware-based AI acceleration, and also now ray tracing or RT cores for hardware-accelerated real-time ray tracing. The question is, how does AI or ray tracing affect your gaming experience or the performance of Turing-based GPUs? So for AI, the practical application that NVIDIA has demonstrated is DLSS, or Deep Learning Supersampling. Per NVIDIA, DLSS leverages a deep neural network to extract multidimensional features of the rendered scene and intelligently combine details from multiple frames to construct a high-quality final image. Simply put, this allows the GPU to render half of the pixels in any given frame and then have the tensor cores work out how to intelligently fill in the rest of the pixels based on what the AI has learned over time, resulting in reduced GPU overhead and better performance. Unfortunately, outside of a Final Fantasy 15 demo that was distributed, we can't really test this in any real-world games yet. Implementation is promised in about 25 existing or upcoming games, so this will be something to return to once the software catches up. Now, as for those RT cores that were specially built for ray tracing, we're kind of in the same situation with the software in that we really don't have any games available that we can effectively test with. Battlefield 5 is the game that NVIDIA demoed at the event, creating a whole RTX on, RTX off meme in the process, but even that title won't implement ray tracing until a patch sometime after launch. NVIDIA is currently listing 10 games that are promising real-time ray tracing support in the future, and DirectX ray tracing for Windows itself is coming as part of the Windows 10 October 2018 update. So we still have some time before ray tracing is a thing. Personally, I do think ray tracing is good. Generally speaking, it's the next step in realistic lighting for gaming and other applications. But the real question is, does this bring value to the consumer that justifies the exorbitant cost of these graphics cards? And for now, the answer to that is definitely no. NVIDIA needed to get the hardware out there though to support ray tracing. So hopefully now that the hardware is out there for some people, software development will start to implement support in a meaningful and measurable way for future titles. So other than the tensor cores for AI and the RT cores for ray tracing, what else is actually new with Turing? There is some good news. NVIDIA says that Turing sports a dramatic 1.5x boost in shading efficiency per CUDA core compared to Pascal. That's enabled by two key architectural changes: a new independent integer data path allowing integer and floating point operations to run concurrently, which should boost asynchronous compute performance. Remember when talking about async compute performance was all the rage with GPUs? As well as a new memory path for each SM unit to unify shared memory, texture caching, and memory load caching into one unit. Also, we've now upgraded to GPU Boost 4.0, which features a second temperature inflection point to provide an easing off of clock speeds in case of overheating versus a more significant drop to the GPU's base frequency, which is how it worked before. So now let's move on to benchmarks, and for these benchmarks I am attempting to be practical by focusing on existing software and games that you can play right now if you buy these graphics cards with a mix of DirectX 11 and DirectX 12 titles, and I'm pretty much ignoring the tensor cores and the RT cores and the RTX ops things because they're not practical for home users right now. My test system though is going to be an Intel Core i7-8700K 6-core 12-thread processor running at 4.6 GHz on all cores and then 4.8 GHz turbo on one or two cores. The motherboard is an Asus ROG Strix Z370-i. Yes, it's mini ITX. It was supposed to be portable. And then the memory is a G.Skill Flare X 16 gig kit. That's 2x8 gigs in dual channel mode, DDR4 3200 speed, cast latency 14. For cooler, I have the Noctua NH-L12S low profile cooler with a Noctua NF-A12X25 PWM 120mm fan on top. And then for main operating system drive, the Samsung 960 Pro NVMe M.2 512 gig SSD. Now for comparison, I have chosen manufacturer overclocked graphics cards. This is for a couple reasons. First of all, it's been a couple years since the 10 series launched. If you're gonna buy one of these cards, chances are you're gonna buy a third-party add-in board vendor's version of the cards, and there's also a decent chance that those cards are gonna be overclocked some. Even if you're buying a reference design or a stock clocked version of a 1080 or 1080 Ti, overclocking them is very simple, and these are only gonna be running at about 1900 to 2000 megahertz, which is a very reasonable manufacturer overclock for just about anyone who buys one of these cards. So to that end, I have the Asus ROG Strix GTX 1080 Ti 11 gig right here. This is the OC version. And then I have the EVGA GeForce GTX 1080 for the Win 2, also a manufacturer overclock version, 8 gigs of memory on that one. And then for AMD, I am comparing their fastest currently available graphics cards, the Radeon Vega 64, and this is also the Asus ROG Strix version of that, which comes with a manufacturer overclock of 1590 megahertz on the GPU. So my first slide here is actually the frequencies that all the cards are running at, which is a good way to start before we look at benchmark result numbers. Each card has a boost clock as well as a base clock. Then there's the max frequency that it hit, and then the average frequency that it was running at under load. The RTX 2080 Founders Edition has a base clock of 1515, a boost of 1800. It was actually boosting up to as high as 1980, but while under load over time is running at around 1905. The 2080 Ti Founders Edition has a base of 1350, a boost of 1635, was boosting up to about 1950, but only briefly as it was running at around 1740 megahertz under load. And our first test, 3DMark Firestrike. This is Ultra mode in 4K, and here we can see the dominance of the 2080 Ti, and this is going to continue. Spoiler alert, the 2080 Ti wins everything. So I'm going to use that kind of as my 0 points. That's 100% performance right there. And if you compare the other cards here, and I'm really just looking at the graphics score, 2080 Founders Edition is about 20% slower, coming in with a score of 6452, whereas the 1080 Ti was about 9% slower, scoring 7403. Vega 64, unfortunately, coming in last with a score of 5399. That's about 33% slower than the 2080 Ti. Next up is 3DMark TIMESPY. This is a DirectX 12 test. Again, the 2080 Ti Founders Edition coming in with a massive 13,286, the highest score I've ever achieved with a single GPU. 2080 Founders Edition still performing quite well with a score of 10,799. Here it does outperform the Strix GTX 1080 Ti, which might be an indication of the asynchronous compute improved performance. And then finally for synthetics is VRmark Blue Room, a bit of a virtual reality focused test. Here it actually wants a score over 100 frames per second, and I still haven't achieved that with any GPU, although the 2080 Ti came very close with a score of 98.9 frames per second, and this is actually just about double the score of the GTX 1080 and the Vega 64. Next here is Ashes of the Singularity Escalation DirectX 12 test, and this is running on crazy presets. At 4K here, we have a score of 77.4 frames per second, all the way down the line to the Vega 64 coming in with 44.6 frames per second, 42% behind the score of the 2080 Ti. And then moving over to 2560 by 1440, we can see a similar breakdown when it comes to the overall performance with the 2080 Ti winning again. And since the 2080 Ti is really running away with it here, I think the comparison is going to be between your RTX 2080 Founders Edition, which is $800, and the GTX 1080 Ti, which you can usually get for around $650 to $700. I'm marking this one as $700. So keep an eye on those two as we switch over to 1920 by 1080, 101.7 frames per second for the 2080 Ti, but the 1080 Ti is beating the 2080 Founders Edition here with a score of 90.9 frames per second. And now here's Rise of the Tomb Raider in 4K. This is also DirectX 12. I did not test Shadow of the Tomb Raider for these benchmarks, but I will be testing that in the future. 2080 Ti with a score of 71.8 frames per second. And here the 2080 and the 1080 Ti are pretty much neck and neck with a little over 57 FPS. Here at 2560 by 1440, the 2080 Ti runs away with it once again with a 132.4 frames per second on average, and then the 2080 and 1080 Ti are also battling out at about 107 FPS. Both of these are 19% behind the 2080 Ti, and that 1080, even with its overclock, is just half of the performance of the 2080 Ti, so that's a pretty impressive number there as well. Finally, for 1920 by 1080, 170 FPS for that 2080 Ti, and here we did get some additional performance out of the 1080 Ti, so it was able to beat the 2080 with a score of 164.2 frames per second. And now here's GTA 5. I will continue to run this benchmark as long as it continues to be a popular game that people are playing, which will probably last until GTA 6 comes out. That said, at 4K, 97 frames per second, this is again the best single GPU performance I've seen in this game, especially at 4K, although the 1080 Ti is showing an impressive follow-up with 80 frames per second. Moving over to 2560 by 1440, 157 overall FPS for the 2080 Ti, and then finally with the 1920 by 1080 scores, we can see that we're pretty much CPU limited entirely with the 2080 Ti, 2080, and 1080 Ti scoring 164 FPS, and then just a little bit of fall off for the 1080, while the Vega 64 comes in with a respectable 128 FPS, but still 22% behind the performance of the 2080 Ti Founders Edition. Here's Total War Warhammer 2. We're running the campaign benchmark in the Ultra preset, and at 3840 by 2160, again, 2080 Ti wins with 69 frames per second. 1080 Ti and 2080 are pretty much neck and neck here as well. Although if we move over to 2560 by 1440, the 2080 Founders Edition gains a little bit of a lead with a 92 frames per second score versus 84 FPS from the 1080 Ti. Finally, for 1920 by 1080, we're once again hitting some CPU limitations, so we're scoring about 120 frames per second for the highest end cards, although we do still have a drop for the 1080, and the poor Vega 64 coming in with a 40% lower score than the 2080 Ti in this test. But that's okay because it does a little bit better in Battlefield 1. This is Battlefield 1 at 4K, DirectX 11 mode. 2080 Ti comes in with over 100 frames per second. The Vega 64 is at least able to beat the GTX 1080 in this test with a score of 61 FPS versus 56. At 2560 by 1440, we have a very impressive 171 FPS by the 2080 Ti, so for those of you looking at 1440 high refresh rate monitors, I think this might be a good choice for you if you have the money, of course. And even that 2080 Founders Edition coming in with 138 FPS here. But if we move over to 1920 by 1080, we're again a little bit CPU limited, scoring around 190 frames per second for the 1080 Ti, and 2080 Ti drops off a little bit with the 2080, and then the For the Win 2 1080 coming in with 144 frames per second. And finally, here is Overwatch. We're running with Epic settings, so at 4K that actually is pretty challenging for a lot of GPUs. We can see the Vega 64 only managing 71 frames per second here. That is 43% behind the 2080 Ti, which comes in with 125 frames per second. And here again, the 1080 Ti is pulling its weight with a score of 111 frames per second, handily beating out the 2080 Founders Edition. If we move to 2560 by 1440, we can see some very impressive high frame rates. So again, for those of you guys who are looking at high refresh rate monitors, that is part of the reason why I included these lower resolution benchmarks, including 1920 by 1080, but 231 frames per second from the 2080 Ti. Again, best single GPU performance that I have seen in this test. And finally, here's your 1920 by 1080 results. We are hitting the actual frame limit for the game itself, 300 FPS with the 2080 Ti and the 1080 Ti. We're actually bumping into the game's frame limit, which is 300 FPS for this. So with the 2080 Ti and the 1080 Ti, we're pretty much right up against that. Drop back a little bit for the 2080 Founders Edition with 262 FPS, and the 1080 come in with 224. And finally, here are some power draw numbers for you. It was measured at peak as well as on average during the 3DMark Firestrike Ultra combined test. I'd say the most impressive thing here is that the 2080 Ti Founders Edition has a lower average power draw than the 1080 Ti, while also sporting that much improved performance as you've seen with the tests we've just gone over. 2080 Founders Edition is drawing a bit more than the 1080 For the Win 2, so maybe a little bit of a drop off in efficiency there, but still definitely not bad at all, especially when you compare it to the Vega 64, which was drawing 470 on average with a peak of over 550 watts. As for temperatures, these are just the peak temperatures I saw during my standard testing. 2080 Founders Edition peaked at 78 Celsius. The 2080 Ti Founders Edition peaked at 80. I'm going to do a little bit more expansive temperature testing with overclocking taken into account as well when I do my overclocking video, which is going to be coming up very soon. So don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already for that one. But that's pretty much it for the numbers I have gathered for you guys. Actually, I take that back. I have a few more numbers for you guys because I wanted to sort of gather all of this stuff up into a ball and sculpt it into some form of addressable, easily digestible information for you guys. So I took all the scores from every single test that I ran and I gathered them together to create some averages so we can compare the performance as well as the price to performance. Let's look just at performance first of all. If you consider the 1080 to be your baseline, so that's like your 100% performance mark, across all of my tests, the Vega 64 was 10% slower, which is kind of sad. So we're looking forward to AMD's new stuff, which hopefully will be coming in Q4. 1080 Ti is 31% faster than the 1080. The 2080 Founders Edition is 25% faster, so it did come in a little bit slower overall than the 1080 Ti. And then the 2080 Ti Founders Edition was 50% faster. So going from 1080 to 2080, about a 25% performance increase. That's not too bad. That's actually what we would expect, maybe a little bit more than you'd expect going from generation to generation, or maybe a little bit less than you'd expect if you're considering that it's been 2 years since the last generation. If we use the 1080 Ti though as our baseline, that's your 100% mark for performance. The Vega 64 is 69% of that. The 1080 is 76% of that. The 2080 Founders Edition is 95% of that, so 5% slower. And the 2080 Ti Founders Edition is 114% as fast, so 14% improvement going from 1080 Ti to 2080 Ti. But we can't just look at the performance numbers in a vacuum. We have to compare them to the price that they are charging for these cards. So for the 3 comparison cards, I looked right now to find good prices for what they're charging right now for the cards. Vega 64 you can get for about $580. The 1080 you can get for about $500, but if you're going for a higher end overclock manufacturer designed version, about $550 is the price I'm using for that. $700 for the Strix GTX 1080 Ti. Those are actually harder to find right now, but since you can get them for as cheap as $650, I thought $700 was a good price for a manufacturer overclocked one. And then the 2080 Founders Edition costs $800, and the 2080 Ti Founders Edition costs $1,200. There are potentially going to be lower prices for the 2080 and 2080 Ti, but I'm not going to take those prices into account unless they're actually selling for those prices. I'm not going to be fooled like I was with the 1070, which supposedly was going to be $370 when it launched and never actually was. So here again, if we take the 1080 as the baseline price, the Vega 64 is about 5% more. The 1080 Ti is about 27% more. The 2080 Founders Edition is about 45% more. And the 2080 Ti Founders Edition is 118% more. So line that up with the performance, and for the 2080, you're paying 45% more for about 25% more performance. On this scale, sticking with the 1080 as the baseline, for the 2080 Ti, you're paying 118% more for 50% more performance. But that's not quite as fair. If we switch over and use the 1080 Ti price as the baseline, then you're paying 14% more for a 2080 for 5% less performance, or you're paying 71% more for a 2080 Ti for 14% more performance. And that, I think, really is the story of it when it comes down to these GPUs and what NVIDIA has done with the pricing. My actual thought process as I was going through these numbers, and especially comparing the price to performance, is that NVIDIA shouldn't have called these 2080 and 2080 Ti. They should have made a new Titan class. Differentiate Titan with a few different versions. I mean, they already have the Titan X and the XP and all those. Call these that, and then people might be like, okay, a $1,200 Titan. We've seen that before, and it's somewhat within the range of reason. But I have critiqued NVIDIA before for their Titan class cards and how they've used those as sort of halo products to sort of gradually increase the cost of the mainstream consumer-focused graphics cards. And now we've jumped from the most expensive consumer-focused graphics card being, say, $700-ish outside of the special edition versions to $1,200. That's a pretty significant bump, and for anyone who's looking at price to performance or is on a budget at all, it's just very difficult to recommend these cards. The 2080 maybe is a little bit more of a reasonable offer, but unless you just got money falling out of your butt, then the 2080 Ti is really not going to be the way to go. That said, all the pre-orders have sold out everywhere, so obviously lots of people must have money falling out of their butt. But that's pretty much all I have for this video, you guys. I hope all of these numbers and analysis and everything have helped you guys. I am still just digesting them myself, so I do have a follow-up video with some overclocking plans, and I'm of course going to be doing further coverage on these cards, as well as special third-party add-in board versions of these cards, like this Asus Strix version of the 2080 Ti, which has a 2.7 slot cooler and a new fan design, and is manufacturer overclocked too. But more on that in a future video. If you guys enjoyed this one, definitely hit hit the thumbs up button and subscribe, of course, and let me know in the comments section how many of these 2080 Ti's you're planning to buy. Probably 3 or 4 each, I'm guessing at this point. Thanks again, though, for watching this video, guys, and we'll see you next time.